Good old Denuvo. You know, that controversial DRM that has become pervasive in PC gaming to the point that most big budget titles now launch with it. The silver lining is that some of these games eventually have their Denuvo implementation removed by the developers, which gives players an opportunity to test if its performance was impacted, and if so, to what degree. In this video, we'll analyze performance differences in 6 titles: Metro Exodus, Prey, Conan X Isles, Detroit Become Human, Beyond Two Souls, and Heavy Rain. Let's begin with Metro Exodus, a AAA title that removed Denuvo on 27th of May 2020. Metro Exodus offers DirectX 11 and DirectX 12, though the Xbox Game Pass version only uses DirectX 12. The Windows suffix in its title suggests it uses Universal Windows Platform, but we don't have more definitive proof, so we'll call it the Microsoft version. This gives us multiple cases to compare: Microsoft versus Denuvo, Microsoft versus Steam, and Steam versus Denuvo Steam. The Metro Exodus Launcher EXE is just 25.5 meg. The Denuvo EXE weighs in at 313 meg, 1,227.45% the size of the unprotected EXE. So let's see if the extra 287.5 megs of Denuvo hindered the game's performance. The Denuvo version took 50 seconds to load the main menu on its first run, dropping to 30 seconds on subsequent runs. The unprotected version took 36.43 seconds on its first run, dropping to 19.73 and 10.38 seconds on subsequent runs. So the Denuvo version took 137.25% as long as the unprotected version on its first run, and 289% on its subsequent runs. The Microsoft version took 80 seconds to launch on its first run and dropped to 46.74 seconds on subsequent runs. All games were tested at a resolution of 2560 by 1440. Although Metro was benchmarked with ultra settings and advanced physics, tessellation, ray tracing, and hairworks were disabled to avoid a GPU bottleneck. Metro Exodus is the only game in our list that features a dedicated benchmark executable. Unfortunately, we couldn't get it to work, which forced us to benchmark one of the game's missions. We chose the first, Moscow. Denuvo took 61 seconds to load the first mission on its first run, and 38.4 seconds on subsequent runs. The unprotected version took 54.02 seconds to load the first mission, and 8.73 seconds on subsequent runs. In other words, the Denuvo build took 112.92% as long as the unprotected version on its first run, and 439.86% as long on subsequent runs. But sitting through load times is one thing. What about the impact on game performance? Since the Denuvo and unprotected builds both offer DirectX 11 and DirectX 12, we compared the performance in both. In DirectX 11, the Denuvo build averaged 122.4 frames a second, with a minimum of 79.7 frames, 1% low frames of 70.1 frames, and a 0.1% low of 25.6. The unprotected version averaged 123.7 frames in DirectX 11, with a minimum of 87.9, 1% low of 76.6, and 0.1% low of 30 frames. The unprotected build's average was 1.06% higher than the Denuvo build, with a minimum that was 10.29% higher. The 1% low was 9.27% higher, and 0.1% low that was 17.19% higher. If the format of the results look different, it's because we ditched Fraps for MSI Afterburner, as Fraps wouldn't work in DirectX 12. And speaking of which, what did DirectX 12 do for Metro Exodus? Degrade performance, apparently, at least on the testing machine. The Microsoft build averaged 115.1 frames, with a minimum of 83.1 frames, 1% low of 54 frames, and a 0.1% low of 27.5 frames. Denuvo averaged 114.5 frames with a minimum of 56.5, a 1% low of 61.5, and 0.1% low of 28.9. And the unprotected build averaged 116.1 frames, a minimum of 60.9, 1% low of 65.9, and 0.1% low of 29.2. Compared to the Denuvo build, the unprotected version's average was 1.4% higher, its minimum was 7.79% higher, 1% low was 7.15% higher, and 0.1% low was 1.04% higher. Before we proceed any further, we'd like to present a brief update on the status of the channel. We've noticed that YouTube only notifies subscribers of our videos if they have something to do with Denuvo. In all other cases, the majority of our subscribers are never notified that our channel has uploaded new videos. Maybe the administrators at YouTube don't like Denuvo either. If you haven't set the bell to all notifications, we recommend you do so now if you'd like to watch more content like this. You'll need to subscribe first if you haven't already. We only upload once every month or two, so we don't contribute to any notification spam if that's why you're hesitant. Let's move on to Prey, a game we benchmarked in a previous video. That video was made before Prey's Denuvo protection was removed and only compared the performance of its Denuvo protected version to the Microsoft build available in the Xbox app. Although the Steam version still uses Denuvo, the developers made the game available on GOG, a DRM-free store. Denuvo took 54 seconds to load the main menu on its first run, which dropped to 52.8 seconds on subsequent runs. The unprotected version took 17 seconds to load the main menu on its first run, dropping to 12.94 seconds on subsequent runs. Denuvo took 317.65% longer on its first run, and 408.04% on subsequent runs. To load the benchmarking mission, Denuvo took 74.4 seconds on its first run, increasing to 79.96 seconds on subsequent runs. The unprotected version took 60.17 seconds on its first run, which rose to 73.62 seconds on subsequent runs. Denuvo took 23.65% longer on its first run and 8.61% longer on its subsequent runs. The difference in performance, however, was even more noticeable. Denuvo averaged 148.9 frames, with a minimum of 114.8 frames, a 1% low of 98.9 frames and a 0.1% low of 13 frames. The unprotected version averaged 180.4 frames, with a minimum of 170.4 frames, a 1% low and a 0.1% low of 114.3 frames. For all Prey tests, we maxed all settings except the horizontal view and anti-aliasing, which we kept at SMAA 1 times, to avoid a GPU bottleneck. The unprotected build's average was 21.16% higher than the Denuvo version, while its minimum frame rate was 48.43% higher. The 1% low was 15.57% higher, while its 0.1% low was 779.23% higher. Prey is one of two games we measured frame times on. The Denuvo protected build averaged 6.716 milliseconds, with a maximum of 94.666 milliseconds, while the GOG version averaged 6.202 milliseconds and peaked at 64.412 milliseconds. So Denuvo took 8.29% longer to render the average frame, while its longest stutter lasted 46.97% longer than the GOG version. Let us know which metrics you prefer in the comments, frame times or 1% low frame rates. Let's move on to Conan X Isles, a game that Epic announced they will be giving away for free, but never did. Its Denuvo protected EXE measures 170 meg, twice the size of its unprotected EXE, which weighs in at just 84.9 meg. That's an extra 85.1 meg contributed to Denuvo. Did the weight loss improve the game's performance? To find out, we benchmarked the game's opening sequence to ensure a consistent load on both builds. The Denuvo protected build measured an average of 135.9 frames a second, with a minimum of 99 frames, a 1% low of 92.9 frames and 0.1% low of 31.6 frames. The unprotected version measured an average of 140.7 frames, with a minimum of 100 frames, 1% low of 91.7 frames and a 0.1% low of 34.9 frames. All settings were set to Ultra, except the anti-aliasing, which was disabled to avoid a GPU bottleneck. To summarize, the two builds traded blows, though the unprotected version edged out a lead in most metrics. And at this point, we should talk about the hardware used in these tests. We paired a Ryzen 3700X with 32GB of 3600MHz CL19 RAM and a mildly overclocked 1080 Ti. Let's move on to Quantic Dream's trilogy: Detroit Become Human, Beyond Two Souls, and Heavy Rain. All three were PlayStation exclusives before they became Epic exclusives. Thankfully, none of them are exclusive to anything anymore. Furthermore, their arrival on Steam coincided with the removal of their Denuvo protections. Let's begin with the first title, Heavy Rain. The Denuvo protected EXE measures 346 meg. 1,384% the size of the unprotected EXE, which clocked in at just 25 meg. Did stripping out the 321 meg Denuvo protection improve the game's performance? We benchmarked the first mission, which took 17 seconds to load on the Denuvo version and 10 seconds on the unprotected build. Denuvo averaged 155.4 frames with a minimum of 68.5, a 1% low of 70.9 and a 0.1% low of 56.3. The unprotected build averaged 157.5 frames with a minimum of 71.8, a 1% low of 76.1 and a 0.1% low of 61.3. In other words, the unprotected version's average was 1.35% higher than the Denuvo protected build. Its minimum was 4.82% higher, with a 1% low that was 7.33% higher and a 0.1% low that was 8.88% higher. All settings were set to their highest, except multi-sample anti-aliasing, which was disabled to prevent a GPU bottleneck. Heavy rain is the other test we measured frame times for. The Denuvo version averaged 6.431 milliseconds, with a maximum of 31.019. The unprotected build averaged 6.349 milliseconds and peaked at 28.841 milliseconds. Denuvo took 1.29% longer to render the average frame, and its biggest stutter lasted 8.91% longer than the GOG build. For Beyond Two Souls, we benchmarked the Epic build before and after it was patched to remove Denuvo, not the Steam version. The Denuvo protected EXE measures 312 meg. That's 975% the size of the unprotected EXE, which clocks in at just 32 meg. The EXE dropped 280 meg when Denuvo was patched out. Did this translate into better performance? We benchmarked the prologue to ensure a consistent load on the protected and unprotected builds. All the settings were set to their highest, though we found no way to remove the frame cap. We used a mod to disable the 60 frames per second cap, but we found no way to disable VSync, which limits the frame rate to the refresh rate. Denuvo took 34 seconds to load the main menu on its first run, dropping to 27 seconds on its second run and 14.57 seconds on its subsequent runs. The unprotected version took 23 seconds to load the main menu on its first run, 7 seconds on its second and 14 seconds on subsequent runs. It didn't take quite as long to load the prologue, which took the Denuvo protected version 9.8 seconds and the unprotected build 5 seconds. The improvement in performance was less consistent. Denuvo averaged 163.5 frames, a minimum of 151.2 frames, 1% low of 121.7 frames and a 0.1% low of 39.3 frames. The unprotected version averaged 163.9 frames, with a minimum of 153.5 frames, 1% low of 133.6 frames and a 0.1% low of 68.3 frames. Comparing the two, the unprotected build measured an average frames that was 0.24% higher, minimum frames that was 1.52% higher, a 1% low that was 9.78% higher, and a 0.1% low that was 73.79% higher. And to round out the trilogy, Detroit Become Human. We used the Epic version for both versions, before and after Denuvo was patched out. Detroit's Denuvo version is 465 meg, 843.92% the size of the unprotected EXE, which clocked in at just 55.1 meg. The EXE shed 409 meg when its Denuvo implementation was removed. But did this result in improved performance? To find out, we benchmarked the game's first mission. All options were maxed except motion blur, which was disabled. We also tweaked the configuration files to disable the frame rate limiter. The Denuvo protected build took 96 seconds to load the main menu, 274.29% as long as the unprotected EXE, which took just 35 seconds. Both versions took a little over 9 seconds to load the first chapter. But what about frame rates? Denuvo averaged 81.1 frames with a minimum of 55.1, 1% low of 55.7, and a 0.1% low of 37.4. The unprotected version averaged 81.8 frames with a minimum of 55.4, 1% low of 56.7, and a 0.1% low of 38.4. This improvement of 0.5 to 1 frames per second might seem insignificant, but perhaps calculating the relative difference might be useful. The unprotected EXE measured 100.86% the average of the Denuvo protected build, 100.54% of the minimum frames of the Denuvo build, 101.8% of the 1% low, and 102.67% of the 0.1% low. If you haven't picked up this game already, it's definitely worth consideration now. For more information, feel free to watch our review in the top right corner. And that concludes this analysis of Denuvo's impact on performance and loading times. We hope this return to classic content satisfies subscribers that were turned off by our videos on Reddit. In the interest of transparency, the channel lost hundreds of subscribers because of those videos. Though to be fair, we gained hundreds of subscribers who did like the videos. We just hope those new subscribers aren't put off by our return to gaming content. If you subscribe for the Reddit videos, let us know in the comments section if you're going to stick around. If you like this video, please press the like button and share it too, because YouTube won't. Several subscribers have reported that YouTube are screwing with their notifications, even when the bell button is enabled. So if that's true, just keep an eye out for our thumbnails. Help us, channel subscribers. You're our only hope. New videos will also be announced on Twitter, so please follow us over there too. Link is in the comments and the description below. We have a secondary channel we're using as a backup, just in case. So head over to there and like and subscribe that one too. While you're here, feel free to watch our analysis on Denuvo's history and performance impact, our analysis of Battlefield 5's controversies, and our hardware analysis of CPUs and graphics cards.